Hi, my name is James Kicklighter. I'm a film director. Recent titles include The Sound of Identity, Angel of Anywhere, and my upcoming film, The American Question, which will be out later this year. I've been directing narrative films, documentaries, and ad campaigns since 2005, and I'm very excited to see what happens with our new film later this year. So thank you guys for having me.
Welcome to Scratch, Claw, Push, a podcast about artists clawing out a place for themselves in the world. I'm Billy Joe Cones.
And I'm Brendan Duke. Let's go.
Thank you so much for being here. It's great to have you.
Right at the top, you kind of came into your film career from a somewhat unconventional way, like in your college major. Tell us about that.
I got a degree in public relations, which sometimes confuses people because they say, aren't you a director? And part of that was really because at the time, Georgia Southern, where I went to school, did not have a proper film program. They do now. But that was what I had been doing, since high school. And that was my goal, to be a director. And so I went to the head of our department really upset and bothered. I was like, I don't want to get a TV degree. I'm not going to do TV news. That's just not helpful for me. And she said, well, have you thought about getting a degree in public relations? I was like, why would I do that? And she explained to me that a PR degree would help me with three things. One, it would help me understand the audience that I would be communicating to in the films I was making. Two, it would help me understand how to package and produce those projects because you have to do a lot of presentations when you're packaging things, understanding how to make decks and how to understand who the audience might be. And three, of course, doing things like this. A lot of your job as a director is promoting your projects, talking about yourself, sometimes too much, but that's sometimes your job. And so a PR degree really helped me to understand all three of those things, which makes me approach directing in a slightly different way. And part of that advice, of course, was that as you keep directing, you start to understand what works and what doesn't work. And it was some of the best advice I ever got because a lot of it's just trial and error, understanding what you're good at, what you're bad at, and how you need to find people to help.
So in your early days of coming out of the PR degree and going into directing, you said it's a lot of trial and error. So what were some of the trials and errors that you had?
Well, my first short film out of college was a zombie short called Followed, and that was a really informative piece for me because up until that point I'd been doing documentary work. I had done a short film called The Car Wash that was a little bit more simple. That was in a contained space with 2 or 3 actors. But with Followed, we had, visual effects makeup, we had extras, we had all of these different components that weren't just, 2 people talking in a room. And so that was a great trial and error experience to understand how to direct something a little bit bigger. If I go back and watch that now, of course, I'm horrified. I'm like, gosh, I should have done this differently with background talent. There are things I would have changed, obviously. But the great thing about film is the more you do, the more you're able to understand what works and, again, what doesn't work. And so then if you're, sensible about it, you're going to learn about the things that you did right and the things you did wrong and how you can improve each time.
So you've also, in addition to, you've got a few shorts out there, but you also kind of some of your more recent features have been documentaries. Was that something you set out to do, or was it something you just kind of found your way into?
Well, it's a mixture of both, really, because lately, you're right, I have been doing more documentary work, but some of that's been because of the challenges of doing independent film with the parameters of the pandemic, because of the parameters of the strikes. And so it's been a little bit easier to do documentary work in recent years. However, that doesn't mean that I don't want to keep doing narrative work. In fact, there's a little short film we're going to be directing later this month in June 1st, that I'm really excited about. And so I think for me, it's really being able to straddle between making documentary pieces, making scripted pieces, making advertising, because I truly do enjoy all three. And so it's just trying to find opportunities always to tell the stories that I'm interested in and the stories that people want to hire me for. Those two things are important.
So speaking of that, a long time ago, I went and I read, if you start to read or watch a lot of directors, content, Content's that's a bad word. I'm sorry. And I'm going to take that back. Okay. Like, for instance, if you read all of Tennessee Williams' works, right, you start to see what he's obsessed with. If you watch Paul Thomas Anderson, you see what he's obsessed with, right? So you kind of get what their thing is. So what is your thing?
I've always been drawn to stories about loss and identity and how that pertains to characters. And so I think if you were to line up all of my work across the board, it doesn't matter if it's scripted or documentary work, etc., I think you'll find strong character driven pieces that deal with issues of loss and identity. And the thing about that is it can really range in a variety of different ways. My first student short, The Car Wash, was about someone grappling with becoming older and what that meant to her. The Sound of Identity is about a performer that's on the cusp of success and might make it or might not. The American Question is about how America perceives its identity and what that means for our culture. So I think for me, if you were to really look at that, it's always exploring those themes. And fortunately, there's lots of ways to explore them.
With the Sound of Identity, which I will recommend wholeheartedly to anyone. I watched it, I think it's like a while back, right after it first dropped on streaming, and I was really impressed with just how you dealt with the subject matter, because that's like such a hot, like the whole issue of transgender people and all that pertains to is a really hot button issue these days. And you dealt with it not like in a sensationalistic way, but in a very kind of nuanced, like looking at it from multiple sides, kind of saying like, without being, again, like, oh, here's a trans person doing a thing. How did you transition? Blah, 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 blah. It really, it did it in a way that I thought was very humanizing. And also the way the film was done, it really kind of, it captured that drama without kind of feeling like you were using any cheap tricks. Can you tell us more about just that movie in general?
Yeah, I think for me, a big part of my approach in filmmaking, again, is the character driven piece. And to me, trans is who someone is, it's not who their entire identity is. Just as much as someone being straight or gay or whatever you might be isn't the totality of your identity. And so I'm much more interested in digging into something more personal. And so in The Sound of Identity, it was very much about a performer, again, on the cusp of international success. It was her debut on the American stage. She was the first trans singer to have a leading role on the American stage. So it was a big international news story in the world of opera. And so for me, I was less interested in how did you transition, because that's not a story. That's just what happened. That's an event. And so I'm much more interested in what's happening now, what's happening in this moment where you're having to lay all of this on the line, everything you've worked for, and maybe it's going to work, maybe it's going to not. How does that impact the way that you see yourself? How does that impact everything that you've done up until this point? That to me is much more interesting than you're trans. That's just, again, the log line, but that's not a story, to me, at least, as a director.
That's great, because it really is like, I know there are people who believe otherwise, but like, it's like I was born in a certain place. I was born with certain genes, and that in and of itself is not, like you said, the totality of who I am or what I become, right? It's
And
how
I
deal
think
with
that sometimes there's the temptation to kind of otherize people that we all have. As you say, trans still to this day is a hot button topic. And I think that when you look at the issues surrounding those things, a lot of folks that otherize trans people aren't actually looking at people as people. They're looking at an idea. And I think that as filmmakers, one of our responsibilities, especially in the documentary space, is to tell stories that humanize who the person is, no matter what their identity might be. Because if I'm trying to understand a subject, I have to understand them as a person, not as a logline. That to me is really important as a director.
And it's definitely become just identity in general. It seems like in the last few years has become such an intense focus, just like on a political level. It's it's on the verge of like things sometimes becoming really tribal, like in just in various in all facets of like American culture. It, like, to the point it's weird. Is that something that kind of drove you to want to take on like the American Question?
Absolutely. I directed advertising for Hillary Clinton's campaign, and me living in Los Angeles and growing up in Bellville, Georgia, to have 123 people, I have always felt that I've been at the intersection of two very different worlds, which is perhaps unusual in directing, because I find that many directors, come out of LA or New York or a major city hub, and there's nothing wrong with that. But I think that there are voices that come out of other places that might see the world in a different way. And I feel like that's something that I have a responsibility to do as a director. And so with the American question, we were exploring how did America become so tribal, not over 8 years, but over 50 years? How did this evolve over time? And how did this come to a culmination during this short period that we've been through over the past couple of years? And so for me, that was imperative to say, how do we break that down? How do we distill this tribalism and provide solutions to the viewer for how you can get out of it? Because I think tribalism at the end of the day is very much a choice. It's something that we all choose to do or not. And sometimes it's just a matter of puncturing why we get so tribal to understand how we've arrived at that point.
So I was going to ask you about that whole growing up in a very small town thing. So I don't even know where to start with this. How has that sort of informed what you do, or how I guess, in your journey? I really want to talk about the journey. So how has that informed your journey to where you are?
Growing up in a small town, everybody knows you, your business, your mama, they know everything about your life, right? And so there are pros and cons to that. But I think that one of the great things about growing up in a small town is the sense of community that you're imbued with, the responsibility that you have to your community. And for me, even though I don't live there anymore, I do have a sense of responsibility to the voices that may not necessarily be heard in culture, which is one reason I think I'm drawn to the types of stories I'm drawn to say, what are these voices, be them rural or trans or anything else, that are outside of what we normally see depicted in culture. And so for me, that is an extension of community that I grew up with, to say, what responsibility do I as a director have to each of these different communities that I'm telling stories about? That for me is really a propelling factor, and I think a large part of growing up in a small town. Because in a large city, you can be totally isolated, weirdly, because it's sometimes hard to connect with different communities or groups just because of the large mass of people that live in a place. Somewhere like Los Angeles, where people live in their cars, I think that's more extrapolated, less so than somewhere like New York, where you bump into people, right? And so for me, that community is really a part of how I, deal with that, but also how I tell those stories about different people.
Do you think that coming from such a small southern town is actually giving you maybe like a better window of understanding, or maybe a better way to communicate? Because if I were to tell someone, okay, this filmmaker came from like a town of like 123 people in South Georgia, and then showed them like what most of your films are about, I'm guessing people who don't really know,
right?
Their heads are going to start spinning around, and it's like you're going to see like the gears, spilling out of their ear, and steam blowing out, because like it's so, I guess, if you don't know anything about the South, if you're someone from like who's only ever lived in New York or only ever lived in LA, you're probably going to hear this, oh, this little Southern kid, what's he going to make movies about? But then you look at the actual subject matter, the diversity of it, they're going to be like, what happened there?
It's a good question. One thing that was really instrumental for me while I was in college, I did study abroad in Montepulciano, Italy, which was something that was the greatest experience of my college career, and also not to mention the cheapest way to travel. If you're in college and you have the opportunity to do study abroad, go do it. You'll never travel so cheaply ever again in your life. And for me, that was really my biggest jaunt out of the South, and where I had grown up and raised. And that informed a lot of how I started to see the world. I became much more curious about it. I was like, okay, these are people that live very differently than I do. What is it that other people in other cultures and other walks of life might also do? And so for me, that was a big eureka moment. And one thing that I started doing afterwards is that after I would finish a project, I would take 2 or 3 weeks and go to a different culture as a reset somewhere around the world to better understand people and places. I've been very lucky to work all around the world and across the US. And I think a large part of that curiosity came out of doing study abroad, truly.
You also did some filmmaking in India, because one of your first films, Desires of the Heart, is a interracial couple, and the man in the couple is from India, and there's like a heavy theme that kind of dips into some of the really old school, well, not even old school, old world Indian culture. Yeah. Talk a little bit about that.
Directing Desires of the Heart was a fascinating experience. We shot for a few weeks in Savannah, Georgia, and about a month and a half in Rajasthan, India. And that experience was really fascinating because I was learning about Indian culture and some of the mythologies of Indian culture. For example, this film covers something called the sati, which is a ritual that was banished when British rule came in around the 1850s, in which if a husband died before his wife, the wife would burn herself at the stake to be reunited in the afterlife. It's a reincarnation ritual that in Indian culture is not very popular to talk about, but it's a fascinating, true piece of story. And that story in Desires of the Heart tackled that. And it was really interesting for me to couple that kind of Indian mysticism with Savannah, because Savannah, obviously, for those that know it, has a lot of ghost stories. Savannah is a place where people think of as being haunted. And the similarities between those two things, even though people in Savannah were not burning themselves on a pyre, there is a lot of cultural similarities and rhythms between those two worlds. And that, for me, again, was where, getting to travel, getting to understand these different patterns between different places in the world that we think of being totally disparate, sometimes have some remarkable similarities.
That's really interesting. Also, even just I don't know, I can imagine filmmaking going from very humid deep south to desert of Rajasthan, because Rajasthan's mostly desert, yes?
It is.
Yeah.
It is entirely desert. It was very hot and we were in the middle of it. Yes.
Yeah. So hot and hot, though.
Hot and hot, just not as humid, but hot and hot, yes.
So are you going around like it's a dry heat?
It's a dry heat, exactly, which is like what we have in Los Angeles. It's a dry heat.
Do they say that in Rajasthan?
Yes. Oh, I don't know. Siri thought I was saying something about it. I don't know that. But anyway.
She likes to do that. Yeah.
She does. She sometimes likes to interfere when we're talking. I'm like, I didn't summon you, Siri. Right.
Machines, they're creeping up on us, man.
They're creeping up on us.
Yeah, whoever named her didn't think about that part.
No, they definitely did not.
I used to work with a guy named Cyrano, and like I almost swear almost anytime someone said his name at work, you would start hearing people's phones going off.
That must be really challenging.
You have to change his name or something.
I would probably.
I mean, no, it's a cool name, but it was one of those that you kind of notice, like every so often somebody would like call out, like, "Hey," and then like you'd hear from them, like, "Yes, what do you want?" And you're like, "Shut up, phone."
Everyone's phones go off at the same time, and he's like, "Not again."
He was totally used to it. You could tell, like it was like he was just kind of like, "Oh, okay, yeah, just."
And that's when he got an Android, probably.
I don't know. I have to ask him, like, what kind of phone do you actually have? No, anyway, but
yeah, I have a question. I have a thought. So I wanted to sort of transition to, we kind of like talked a bit about your work and kind of the overall arc of like what your obsessions are, what you'd like to talk about. I'm curious to know, like, out of college, or what was the first time that you actually tackled a big project on your own? And was there ever a point when I guess I'm curious, like, how you transitioned from, not creating something, being in PR and PR major, to starting to create and understanding how to create your own project?
So I was very fortunate that when I was 16, before I went to college, I worked on a documentary that no one will ever see called That Guy, The Legacy of Dub Taylor, where I partnered with a local college professor I met at a writing conference and convinced my mom I should go on the road and do this. We went to 16 states and interviewed Dixie Carter, John Mellencamp, David Zucker, who directed the Airplane and Naked Gun movies. And that experience, even though none of us knew how to make a film or what we were doing, was very informative for me in how to put a film together. I learned how to write letters to agents. I learned how to coordinate travel, learned how to edit, learned how to shoot a camera, all of these different things. And so when I went to college and got that PR degree, I already knew that I wanted to keep making films. And so, because of that experience, I already had a little bit of a leg up than some of my peers that had some interest because I had already pulled some of those elements together. So, getting out of college, it was really taking the skills I had learned before college in college and trying to add those things up together. And that was really beneficial because I knew what it looked like to put a film together. I knew what it looked like to talk to investors. I knew what it looked like to schedule and package and put a piece together. So that was something that I was very fortunate to have that experience.
I'm amazed that your mom was just like, yeah, that's fine. Go off with this guy and go
She
travel.
trusted him, and he was a good guy, so he wasn't, somebody crazy. So I think that helped quite a bit. And there, it was a local college called Bruton Parker, and we had some mutual people we knew, and so that helped a little bit, I think.
Yeah, but also there's that element of it when you're talking about all the things that you learned from it. Make me think about the fearlessness we have sometimes when we're 16 years old
Mm-hmm.
that we lose by the time we're 20 or so, where all of a sudden it's like there's this fearlessness of youth that we're like, oh, I'll try that. Sure, I'll do this. I don't know. You don't know what you don't know. And so you're not as afraid of it as you are once you've gone through college, I think.
Yeah, because the more experienced you get, the more pressure you have to deliver. It's something we talk about in Sound of Identity very extensively. That as your spotlight kind of widens and you build a reputation, it's harder to make those experiments because your reputation's on the line. The very basis of being a director is that you're only as good as your last project. And so if people didn't like your project, if people didn't see your project, that becomes more challenging to make something. And so you have to really find ways to keep yourself active and curious and somewhat fearless, but also a little bit more measured as you kind of grow into your career.
I'm curious, how did you come to that project of the Sound of Identity, and then like finding out about it? How do you kind of wrap your head around that story? Because I feel like a lot of times when we look, especially when you look at time like history, there's kind of what happens and then there's the story we tell about it.
Yeah, the funny thing about Sound of Identity is that I got that project because in 2017 I was invited to this event called Tulsa Tomorrow that was showcasing the future of Tulsa, Oklahoma, because I'd been working on the American Question. We shot that on off for 8 years, I should mention. So that was kind of a little summer camp we kept going back to. And that was at the very beginning of it. And while I was on that trip, I met some producers that were based in Tulsa, and we talked for maybe 20 minutes. I guess I made a good impression because about a year and a half later, they called me and said, hey, we're partnering with some producers in Los Angeles and some other folks on this film called The Sound of Identity. Well, at the time it was called Lucia's Voice. And they told me the log line of the story, we're going to have the first trans opera singer to have a leading role on the American stage. What do you think about that? And I told them no 3 times because I said I wasn't sure what that story was going to be, and they were absolutely convinced I was the right director. And so finally they told me, would you talk to Lucia and see what you think? And once I spoke to her, I kind of wrapped my head around how I wanted to tell that story. Again, not the log line, but something different. And fortunately, the producers were on board with that vision, and they hired me to direct it.
So why did you say no 3 times?
I said no 3 times because I didn't know anything about opera, and so I was really hesitant to direct a film that was about the first trans opera singer to have a leading role on the American stage because how am I supposed to tell this story about this world I know nothing about that's extraordinarily specific? Two, it was that logline problem. I was thinking about it, well, she's trans, that is what she is, but is there a story in that? And so when I spoke to Lucia, I found that there were some personal things going on in her life pertaining to this event, namely that her father was going to see her for the first time in 10 years because she'd been living abroad in Germany, and he might come to this performance. That, for me, was the eureka moment. I said, okay, that's what this film's actually about. This is about a performer that is laying everything on the line that they've worked for their entire career, and something very personal is also happening within this same space. And then I knew what story I wanted to tell. It wasn't just about her being trans, it was about the reason that we do what we do as artists. And it also is about the pressure that comes with that when you're on that large stage for the first time.
Yeah, I'm curious because you just mentioned you've been shooting this The American Question, which actually comes out this year. Do you have like an official release date?
I can't tell you yet, but stay tuned. It will be out before the election, though.
Okay, I'm curious because like 8 years working on a thing sounds insanely daunting. How do you deal with, like, did you start out going, okay, yeah, we're going to shoot this thing for like almost a decade and then put it together? Because I mean, on one hand, yeah, you shoot the thing. Okay, that's fun. But at some point, you got to sit down and go through that footage and then craft a narrative around it.
There are some real challenges to spending a long time making a film. One, there's real events that are changing your plot in real time. So that's one thing that you're having to cope with. And so the way I approached The American Question was really in tranches. There are 4 editors credited on the film, and that's because we did different editorial passes throughout the entire process. And I engaged different people that specialized in different things to help us get there. So the first pass with Carlos Puga was really about identifying which characters have we filmed or we're following. That was something that we really had to figure out. And so we did that, in 2017, 2018. And then as we put that piece together, then we started bringing in experts to answer things that these subjects were talking about. And then we started piecing those things together into a kind of boring edit that merged those talking heads together with the experts. And then we brought in and that was by J.D. Sievertson. And then we brought in Mohammed El-Masterli, who worked on the kind of character-driven edit to really polish it and make it fly. And then I came in and did a final pass at the very end to really tie in all of those elements together. And so the long and short answer to that is, one, deciding when you're going to finish, because you can endlessly be filming in something like that. You've got to set some parameters. And then secondly, just really, again, going as you film, editing, filming, seeing what you have, and then molding and shaping from there. Because in this film, since we were talking about the process of how America became polarized over time, one thing that I could have done is taken all of the footage and turned it into a miniseries. We had plenty of footage, and it was extremely possible to do that. But I felt it was really important that if we were going to make a film about polarization that I could show to my family in Bellville and my neighbors in Los Angeles, that it was important to do that in 90 minutes, that I didn't need to give you 8 episodes to find an answer. That was an extremely large challenge, but I'm very proud that we were able to pull that off.
Did you initially start out with that kind of 8-year block in mind, or were you planning for it to be smaller and then just as the political landscape has kind of swung back and forth over these years? Did that affect like the end goal, or was it always that kind of?
Originally, it was going to be 4 years. We thought it was going to be a 4-year film. And then as we got to year 4, I realized this needs to be a little bit longer. And fortunately, we had some investors that supported that decision. It's very challenging to make that pitch, to say that we're going to shoot something here and there, and we're not exactly sure what it's going to be. Investors do like having some sense of security. And so we did take a little bit of a gamble on that to say, can we pull this off, and can we treat this like a summer camp that we keep coming back to. But as that landscape kept shifting, the people that were involved with that project saw what we were doing and understood that's what we had to do to make it work.
So as you're out there, I guess, collecting all these different stories, what is the, like the filtering process to decide like what makes it and what doesn't? Are you kind of going in there with people just and then pointing them in a very specific direction? Or are you kind of just letting them talk and you say like maybe making mental notes or even like literal notes as they're talking? Okay, that makes it, okay, maybe this can just kind of go off to the side, or how does that work?
The one thing that I tend to do in interviews is, I'll generate a list of questions and such that we're going to ask, but then I'll follow the interview and let it evolve, because if someone says something that's going to spit us in a different direction, we do that. But in the case of the American question, the way that I kept that orderly is I knew that there had to be some sort of structure that would make sense to a viewer. I thought it would become very confusing if we had this cacophony of people talking about cacophony of projects across different areas. And so I settled on a structural device where we have 3 cities that we follow people: Detroit, Hazleton, and Erie. And in those cities, they each represent something different. And so by having those topics based around clusters, based on towns, it makes it palatable to the viewer, I hope, to be able to follow these stories and these people. So instead of having someone in Detroit talk about a topic that you might hear in Hazleton, we stick to things in different lanes, and each city representing one specific topic and then blending it with experts to clarify. That was the structure that we settled on, and I think that gives the film a little bit more order than you might have if you kind of mix it all up.
So yeah, I mean, how did you decide on those cities? Was it more just like access, or was it something about those cities that stood out that you said will be particularly?
Hazleton is a town that has famous immigration issues, and so that obviously was one of those baskets. That's also a hot button topic in America. Erie was a city that was once a large manufacturing hub that has fallen and started to come back. And Detroit, of course, is a comeback city in many ways that represents urban decay and urban rise and blight and all of those different issues. And so what I thought was really important was to kind of take those 3 different packages: immigration, manufacturing, and economy, and then blend those into 3 cities that could represent those issues very clearly. And then doing that, that gives you a structure that is informed by demographic data, political data, academic data that we can really follow, and hopefully makes it palatable for the viewer.
What are your hopes for the film?
Well, with every film, one thing that I've come to realize as a director is that you have your personal hopes for something, but once you release it to the public, it becomes its own thing. Different people are going to interpret it in different ways. Different people are going to have different takeaways. And specifically with the American question, I think that 10 people are going to watch it and cling to 10 very different things. And so I'm not quite sure what the takeaway is going to be for people, but what I do hope is that the solutions that we posit in the film are things that people can execute in their daily life. I'm under no illusion that we're going to release a film and suddenly there's going to be a kumbaya moment in America and everyone says the American question has all the answers and now we feel better about everyone. I do not believe that will happen. That'd be lovely, but I don't think it will. But I think that if we're able to explore and break down those issues in a way that helps people understand how we've arrived at this moment, that might motivate them to think about what they do in their daily life to make it better.
So going forward right now, are there any projects you have coming up after that you want to talk about or are able to talk about, or what is your next thing?
So I can talk about my next project I'm doing, which is the short film I mentioned. It's called Whatever It Takes, tentatively. It's for a nonprofit group called Kids in the Spotlight, which I've worked with for several years. They are a organization that pairs foster youth with professional filmmakers to tell their stories. The students write the scripts and then go through the development process. And then we actually film it, and there's a great red carpet premiere at Paramount. It's a wonderful program, and so I'm really excited about doing that. There's a couple of other things in my development slate that I wish I could talk about that I cannot, but I'm hoping that we're able to move forward with one or two of those in the next couple of months. We're very close, so we'll see what happens.
Very cool. So for any aspiring young filmmakers out there who are, using their iPhones in their day-to-day life and making content or whatever they're doing, because things are so different, I think, than when we were all kids to now, and what kids have access to, and what, tools wise and information and everything. But then there's also different obstacles that they have, like dealing with social media all the time. Or I don't know, just there's a lot more pressure, I think, than there was back then. So do you have any advice for someone who is 16 right now and wants to get into filmmaking?
The great thing about now, as opposed to when we were coming up, is that everyone's got an iPhone. You can make a film very simply. The challenge you have is that everyone else also has an iPhone, and everyone else can make a film very simply. And so this is where I talk about the PR skills that I gleaned in college, to say that you can make something, you can put it on the internet, but that does not mean anyone's going to see it, because there is literally so much content, as we've said before, uploaded to the internet every day. So how are you going to make your work distinctive? I think it's really important that young filmmakers take their work to film festivals, especially ones that are driven in youth or student categories. One thing that I like to say is look for festivals that have been around for 10 years, that have good sponsors, that have press, because the only way you're going to start breaking through the clutter of the internet is to be able to get your films reviewed, to get some interviews with some legitimate press outlets, and to get people to know that you exist. Because one of the challenges of working in film is no one cares about your work until they do. You're not going to have an agent normally coming out of a short film. You're going to have to build a portfolio to get to a point where there are people that are helping you do things. And so I believe that making your best work and learning by trial and error, you can do that now in ways you just couldn't before. You can make 5 or 6 short films on your phone until you figure out this is the one that makes sense, and then take that out to festivals. Make those mistakes, and then find ways to make sure people know you exist and they see your work. And that's PR. That is not making a film. That's understanding that there has got to be a way for people to know, and it's not just posting it on the internet. That's the thing that I like to tell people quite a lot.
That's a really good point. That I liked what you said about nobody cares until they do, because I think that's true of so many artistic disciplines. And people do think like, well, I have Instagram, I posted it. And it's true that that's not enough. And you'd almost be better off not bothering to post anything than wasting your time posting things without a strategy.
Yeah, and that's only if you want to be a director. There's a kind of famous joke that there are 2 entry-level positions in Hollywood, and that's director and production assistant. Everything else requires a lot of, rising up through the ranks. But if you're able to find consistency in directing your own projects by putting those things out, by letting people know you exist, and of course, ultimately turning out work that people like, you're able to keep working consistently. And I am not saying that is easy. It is hard. And, I recognize for every person that is like myself that's found consistency with that, 50 haven't. And so I'd make no predications that that's an easy thing to do. But the entry to access is so much easier than it used to be. And so why not take those gambles that you can make in your youth to say, what can I do with my phone? What kind of stories can I tell? And then how can I find ways to make sure that people in the industry know I exist? That's what you can do.
Do you find that I'm sorry, Billy, the getting them go, like, keep staying on this same social media thing, do you find that all those PR skills you learned as your major have helped now that as the social media world comes along, it now suddenly feels like everybody's got to be like their own PR department or their own marketer?
I think that there is only so far you can go with social media marketing unless you have become some type of influencer. I think that I use social media in very specific ways where I kind of treat Instagram as a bundle, Facebook as a bundle, Twitter as a bundle, et cetera. And so they're really thought of in different ways and how I treat those audiences differently. But ultimately, for my film career, it's going to be the interviews I do. It's going to be the reviews I get. It's going to be people talking about something on Rotten Tomatoes or IMDb. Those are the things that people in the industry are going to cling to. And then once you build that reputation, if those people follow you back on Instagram or Facebook, then you're able to engage with them in more personal ways. But I think that there is a level of which social media can be a cap unless you, again, become an influencer. And that's something that also is a hard thing to do.
So going back to what you were saying before about, it's not easy to get into these things, but also I think some people fall into that trap of, okay, well, I've developed my cinematography skills. I directed some things, but in order to make a living,
Mm-hmm.
they will go and do a bunch of other stuff. And obviously you've done that too, I'm sure.
Yeah.
But then the question is, a lot of people will then go, well, I'm not getting the type of work I want to be doing. So I guess my question for you is what would you say to those people? How do you keep on track with, this is the path I want to take. These are the things I take for money, but I want them to be at least adjacent to my path so I'm headed in the right direction.
Well, I'll be the first to say I've done things in my career that I did not love doing because I needed to get a paycheck, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so, I think that you can't be precious about it. This idea that, I'm a cinematographer and I can only shoot scripted things is nonsense to me. You want to be shooting. And so if that means it's an ad, a documentary, a corporate video, whatever it is, find ways to build your portfolio and keep working. I think you can talk and chew gum at the same time. I don't think that there's any reason why you can't be finding those things that propel your career forward while also finding things to supplement them. That can be a challenge, but it's finding ways to say, I work and I know what I'm doing, and I can look to the future and also do what I need to do in the present. And so that just means developing things simultaneously. As a director, that might mean that I'm working on several projects at the same time, which is true. Right now, I'm working on several things at the same time, and we're waiting to kind of see what hits on some and what doesn't on others. And then there's also possibilities for things that can pop up at any given moment. Like yesterday, my manager called me with a project that maybe someone's interested in me directing that I didn't know about 2 days ago. That is also part of it. And so that is the skill that you have to develop to say, how can I keep working while also working towards my broader goals? And that includes me too. I think that there's very few directors or producers or anyone that could tell you honestly that they have stuck to one specific thing and that has been successful for them. Unless you're independently wealthy, that's probably not going to work.
So how do you keep those, how do you, I don't know, I'm trying to figure the way to frame the question, because it sounds like, it's almost like you're describing directors almost like being somewhat like a cook. You've got multiple pans on the fire and you've got to tend to each one differently, when to flip this one or when to turn the heat down on that one. Like, how do you manage all that? Do you have like a system, or are you just feeling your way along as you go?
In many ways, because you are doing multiple dishes in the kitchen, you really have to tend to them and understand what is simmering and what is flaming hot. That is something that takes a little bit of experience to figure out, but in some ways it doesn't too, because it's just common sense in many ways. You're going to know when something is heating up really well because the attachments are coming through, the budgets are coming through, the different pieces you need are happening. And then sometimes there are moments where it seems like it's all coming together, but something might throw that off, like a strike or things like that are outside of your control. And then you say, oh, okay, this thing that was flaming hot has just turned back down to simmer. What else do I have here that I can work on? that's one reason why I think it's really important not to put all of your eggs in a single basket, but to really distribute the things you're working on across different mediums and across different spaces. Because then if something does simmer down, you have something else you can turn back up.
Yeah, I guess what my thought is then, going back to the question I asked before, is like for those people who kind of get stuck in the, I guess, how do you not get stuck in the just trying to make a living part of it? Like, because I know people like that who are like, oh, I'm just doing these like corporate interview things. I'm doing little promo pieces for, and I feel, I get the feeling that sometimes when those people get stuck in that and they don't want to be stuck in that, it's like this wah-wah sort of feeling, Debbie Downer sort of thing. What would you advise them to get out of that, I guess?
You have to have a strategy. I think that if you do feel like you're stuck in something specific, sometimes that means that you're going to have to make a move to prove otherwise. So, for example, in my own career, recently I've been doing more documentaries, which means that I have to remind people that I do scripted things too, such as the short I'm about to do in 2 weeks. That I have other scripted things I'm developing as well. But like I said at the beginning of our interview, it's just been easier to do docu stuff. But if you get to a point in your career where the things that you want to do, you're not doing, you have to remind people that you can do them. And so that's not the reason I'm doing this specific short, for the record, but it does give me that opportunity to remind people, oh yeah, I do have scripted experience and I just happen to have been doing documentaries as of late. That is something that you sometimes have to take the onus to own. That's sometimes saying that I made $5,000 on this gig and I need to spend $2,000 of my own money to do something small. That is sometimes you having to motivate, because again, if you're not doing that, sometimes other people aren't going to do it for you.
And so you said you do commercials. Do you still do commercials?
I do. Yeah. I again, like as of late, I've been doing more docs, but yes, I have done commercials too.
And okay, so, I'm an actor, and a lot of actors that I know, some, not a lot, but some actors I know, you were talking about not being precious, right?
Yeah.
And the idea of like, you do it all because you got to make a living, right?
Mm-hmm.
So there were some stage actors who are like, oh, I don't do commercials. And then later discovered it and were like, oh, okay. But I think that there's so much to be said for if you get, you said being on set, you want to be filming, right? Being on set, getting to know people. Sometimes those actors will get other opportunities because of that. So has that ever happened with you on a commercial set where you've gotten an opportunity for something else that was, like you're on a commercial set, you're making the hamburger, you got an opportunity for a filet mignon dinner over here because of the commercial. I'm curious if that's ever happened.
Absolutely. I mean, across the board in every medium I've worked in, oftentimes I will find other opportunities from that experience, because the truth is, it doesn't matter if you are working with a production company, working independently. It's a very creative, collaborative process. And so if you're not on set, being around people who do things on set, you're not in the game. So the best way to keep getting work is not by having you put yourself up for things, your agent, if your manager, if you have them, calling people. It's the work you do and the experiences people have with you. And so when you're on set, people work on other things. If they had a positive experience with you, they're going to call you again. If the production company had a positive experience with you, they're going to call you again. On The Sound of Identity, the producers of that film actually brought me in to re-edit a doc that they had sitting on the shelf because they weren't sure how to make it finished. They had gone through a couple of different editors and they said, hey, James, I know you're primarily a director, but we've got this project that's been sitting here and we think your storytelling skills can help us fix it. And I was able to do that for them because they had a positive experience with me on The Sound of Identity. This happens all the time. But again, you have to be in the game. If you're saying that I can only do this one thing, and if this one thing doesn't work, then I will not work at all. Well, you're not being in the places with people that will hire you. They're not knowing you exist yet again. So that's something that I think never changes. You always have to remind people you exist. And the more you do that, the more they'll remember you.
It sounds like you have to not only remind them you exist, but that, going back to identity, that you are not one thing.
Yeah. And that you're not, and that's something that's really hard to do, I have to say, because especially in entertainment, it's a lot easier, again, if you have an agent or a manager, to kind of pigeonhole this is what you do, because it's easier, truthfully, for executives and production companies and studios to say, oh, this person does this thing. It makes them wrap their head around you a lot better than if you say, I do everything. Because if you say you do everything, people tend to think you don't do all of those things very well. So that's one reason I say, when you let people know you exist and you showcase what it is you do, you need to be able to not only be competent and easy to work with, but make sure that that thing is adjacent to the things that you have been doing, right? So like, say you've been doing corporate interviews. Do they look cinematic? If those interviews look like it was shot in a DSLR, then it's probably not going to be likely that someone's going to hire you to shoot a cinematic documentary or short film or feature film, right? How is the work you're doing helping to advance those broader goals you have? How do they feel adjacent to those broader things? And so I think that's kind of the challenge you have to do in letting people know you exist. It's not just taking every piece of work that you can get. It's also saying, how does this piece of work showcase what my broader skills are? And that I think you can do in lots of different ways, right? You can do that in a corporate interview. You can do that on a short film. You can do that on a documentary. But it's making sure there's a consistency to that work so people can understand what it is you're good at.
Yeah.
Is it kind of just being conscious of, because we talk about identity, like, how you identify yourself professionally to any potential employers?
I always talk about myself as being a director who occasionally produces and sometimes writes. That's how people tend to think about me, first as a director and then sometimes in those other roles, occasionally editor as well, but it's usually in the context of my directing. And so that again makes it easier for people to identify what it is they're going to hire me for. So if it's a documentary, for example, people are going to hire me to direct a more cinematic looking documentary. They're not going to hire me to direct the gritty thing because that's just not what I do. But how does that again extend to those broader goals we just talked about? Since I've worked in scripted film and advertising, things like that, all of that feels adjacent because each of them have a nice cinematic feeling. So there's a consistency there that people are able to identify, and that makes it again easier to hire me because they know what they're going to get.
So where can the people find you online if they want to check out your stuff or at you for whatever reason?
Yeah, I'm on all social media platforms at James Kick, JamesKick. And I'm at jameskicklighter.com. And of course, IMDb, if you want to pull me up there, I'm all across those platforms.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for joining us today. It's been really nice talking to you.
Of course. Thank you for having me. And I hope that I get to talk to you guys again sometime soon.
That will be all for this episode. To keep up with the show, follow us on social media at ScratchClawPush. If social media isn't your thing, you can contact us at scratchclawpush@gmail.com. To learn more about the show, visit scratchclawpush.com. This podcast has been a Carcutta Media production. This recording, or any portion thereof, may not be reproduced or used in any manner whatsoever without the express written permission of the publisher, except for the use of brief quotations in a review. Copyright 2024 by Carcutta Media, LLC, all rights reserved.